Hi, my name is James Mwangi. I am co-founder and CEO of Africa Climate Ventures and also co-founder of the Climate Action Platform Africa, where we are working to unlock Africa's unique potential for climate positive growth. Now, what exactly is climate positive growth, you might ask? Good question. I think most of us, when we think about Africa and climate change, have an image or a challenge along the lines of this image here. Africa has very little of the world, has contributed very little to the world's total stock of emissions. As a result, our economies are still relatively small, and our people are also particularly vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. So if you think about our smallholder farmers, predominantly female, they are dealing with changing seasons, declining yields, and all of the challenges that come with a changing climate. And they have not caused this, and in a way, they are the purest version of a climate victim. And that often is where we start the discussion around climate change in Africa, is the rest of the world has caused it and has gotten rich off of the emissions that are creating the problems around seasons and everything else on the continent. And how is it that we can be supported and compensated as a continent to make up for that and to make up for the lost growth that we will not be able to experience without adding to the climate problem? This picture is correct. To be clear, right? There's nothing untrue about the fact that Africa is unfairly bearing a disproportionate burden from climate change. But it is also incomplete. One of my favorite authors, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, talks about the danger of a single story. And I think here we have a single story of Africa and climate change and climate action that is concealing a different story, an exciting story, a story of Africa's climate potential and opportunity as a leader in climate action. And it is that story that I would like us to explore a little bit. Now, the next picture I want to show you talks about the way we traditionally think about economic growth and greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate change. Historically, almost every economy that has attained any level, actually every economy that has attained a meaningful level of prosperity for its citizens, has seen a vast increase in its greenhouse gas emissions. And typically, you first emit a lot, or your emissions per capita increase, and then your per capita GDP in time as a lagging indicator increases alongside. And you can see that in this picture that has emissions per capita on one axis and GDP per capita on the other, Africa's economies are all clustered in the corner there, as close to 0 and 0 as you can get, on a very different scale from some of the other countries. Now, importantly, you can see that some countries, as they get richer, do start to see some reductions in their per capita emissions, either because historically, you could afford more expensive, cleaner technologies, or also you stop doing emissions-intensive industry at home and push that work to other places. So the idea has been that you don't get rich except by increasing emissions. And the problem for Africa is that if we were to follow this path, what would happen is that the drag, the negative impacts from climate change that would be caused by the increase from Africa's emissions would probably counteract the improved incomes that we would hope to achieve from that path. So we have a challenge, right? Economic growth seems inseparable from emissions growth. And that is the way that we tend to approach discussions around climate and so on in places like the COP. But that link might be breaking. And it unlocks an interesting reality, which is visible in a different picture that comes next. Here we see, yes, historically, the world has grown by emitting more. But looking ahead, Africa in particular has a particular set of resources, which I'll talk about very briefly, that opens up a different way of thinking about economic competitiveness, right? What do we have as our assets? Firstly, we have a lot of untapped renewable energy. We have, and why do we have that? Well, when we think about our renewable energy potential, we're thinking about solar, wind, hydro, and other resources, where particularly because of our unique advantage in solar, Africa has the majority of the world's untapped renewable energy potential. High quality potential. It's not seasonal. We are mostly in the tropics, so we don't have to worry about the impact of winter on our energy production. We have a large workforce, and we have a range of natural resources that proceed from the fact that we have a big landmass and lots of biodiverse resources on top of it. So when we think about wildlife, trees, the biodiversity above, and a lot of geological resources below it. And this isn't just minerals, it's the very nature of the geology underpinning our continent. So these three resources, combined with the fact that we actually don't have, which we've already talked about before, we don't have a big installed base of emissions intensive infrastructure or industry, right? We haven't already fully committed to industries or sectors that have tied up a lot of capital in emissions intensive activity. And that gives us an interesting role to play when we think about the future. Right? Because firstly, we can leapfrog to low emissions approaches to consumption and production. In the past, this meant paying more to get the same thing or less than others who had emitted. But anyone who's looking at the data that's come out in the last few months can see that we are passing the point at which, for example, green energy and a range of other kind of more sustainable technologies are actually outperforming the legacy technologies in many ways. In some cases, they may still be a little bit more expensive if you already have the fossil fuel-based technology already installed and available. But when you don't have it, like here in Africa, you can essentially leapfrog, and it's more readily available, and the price will continue to fall. The second pathway that it opens up is not just our own low emissions consumption and production on the continent, but also producing for the world. What do we mean by this? If we are to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, then we need to look at every single value chain and think about heavy industrial manufacturing and so on, and remove emissions from it. One of the biggest ways that we can do that is shift where certain processes are undertaken. My favorite example, which I'll come back to later, is Africa generates a lot of unprocessed raw materials to export. Historically, it has made economic sense to process those exports in the markets where they are received for a range of reasons linked in part to our colonial history. But when you consider the fact that Africa not only will have the potential to generate the greenest electricity on Earth, but as the price of renewables continues to fall, it'll also be the cheapest electricity on Earth. And we're sitting right next to the biggest workforce on Earth. It begs the question, why aren't we, as a continent, positioning ourselves as the manufacturing and production base for the planet in the 21st century? Not just because it's the most efficient place to do so, but because by doing so, we end up reducing global emissions and global greenhouse gases. It's an interesting implication of things like taxes like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's being introduced in Europe, is that if it really focused on taxing emissions from dirty production, it should create an incentive for manufacturers around the world to move more production activity to Africa, because when you do that, you reduce the amount of emissions you incur across your process of production. It's not easy to prove, but it's a potential. And the third area is removing carbon. And this third area is important to understand in that because we've taken so long as a planet to cut emissions and to protect nature, we will need to not only do a lot of work with nature, protecting our remaining natural carbon sinks, planting new trees, and so on, but we will also need to innovatively find ways to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Now, the approaches to doing that are manifold, and I'll talk about some of those many ways of doing so later in my presentation. But suffice it to say that Africa has the right conditions and the right resources to be a leader in this space. So what are we saying? We can grow without increasing our own emissions. We can reduce other parts of the world's emissions by taking on more of the productive activity of the world in terms of industrial activity. And we can create economic activity from the work of actually removing carbon from the atmosphere, particularly as we begin to have more predictable price signals around the price of greenhouse gas emissions and payments for removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So let's move on. That allows us to paint a slightly different picture of this is a version of the same picture we had before, where you could see that in the past, there was one way to grow. You developed your economy by emitting more. And you started off with low emissions and low GDP, and you went to high emissions and high GDP. We argue, and I think there's a lot of data that suggests that Africa can play three roles for the global economy and for global climate. The first one, the one marked in bright green at the bottom there, is we can increase our own quality of life and increase our own consumption and production without increasing emissions as much, simply by leapfrogging to the latest technologies. This isn't a new story for anyone living on the continent with a mobile phone in their pocket, having never had a landline in their home. We talk about this. We've seen this in other sectors. It'll happen in this sector, and is happening in this sector as well. The second thing, though, is we can reduce emissions that aren't even in Africa today. So these are emissions from countries that are in the high income, high emissions category, where we are taking some of that industrial activity across minerals processing, across energy intensive manufacturing, data centers, green hydrogen, green ammonia, and just doing it in the place where renewable energy is abundant, raw materials are abundant, and labor is abundant. And the third piece of the opportunity is an interesting one. It's that light arrow in the corner, number 3, which is to say that if the world is beginning to pay for removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, something that most experts expect will increasingly happen as we get further into the century and as the impacts of climate change become clearer, then you can actually grow your economy by removing carbon from the atmosphere. In other words, by actually reducing emissions for other folks beyond. And so you're actually going past the zero line. As a country, you're not just going to zero emissions, you're going past it, which is what net zero means. Net zero means I may continue to emit a little bit in the United States or wherever else, but I will pay for someone else to do not only not emit, but potentially to remove. And that allows us to think of an economy that is growing by doing something that hasn't been done before. Growing by increasing our global carbon budget rather than by drawing down from it. Let's move on. So, making this particular vision of climate positive growth a reality, it's very easy to talk about those arrows in theory and so on. Many of you listening to this are probably wondering, is this true or is this wishful thinking? What will it take to make it happen? And what are what progress is being made to do it? And frankly, is this a trend or an idea against which I can deploy capital or make decisions? And I think the answer is increasingly yes, because a lot of data and analysis exists. Some narrative and advocacy work has been done to mobilize the continent. There's policy and regulation beginning to take shape, both in Africa and beyond. And there will be, as I will talk about at the end of our conversation, a number of interesting commercial proofs of concept. So let's jump into some of the data. So in this picture, what you see here is a little bit of a sense of one of the shifts we need to make, right? We currently think about Africa's role in protecting nature as, let's identify this area of forest and protect it. Let's plant trees over there. It's a couple of very narrow interventions. But if we step back and actually think about not just individual efforts, but rather how you mobilize economies to think about, becoming more climate positive landscapes, you start asking questions like, how much carbon could an individual African country sequester in its natural carbon sinks if its farmers were embracing regenerative agriculture approaches, if it was conserving as much natural woodland as possible, and so on. And once you understand that number, And that number usually will vary with the price. And the question is, what is the price that incentivizes the right level of action? The minute you begin to gather that data, it becomes clear that for many African countries, climate positive growth, and particularly the conservation and expansion of natural carbon sinks, which is what this data that we began to gather about 5 years ago is talking to, is a big unrealized economic opportunity. Potentially worth, as these markets continue to evolve and grow, tens of billions, already many millions, hundreds of millions, if not low billions of dollars today, and potentially tens of billions of dollars into the future. Now, what's important here is the importance of thinking systemically. This is not about fencing off part of Africa's natural bounty and saying, keep the people off of it so we can preserve it for the climate. It is rather about how do we mobilize a workforce and a society and a community that's aligned around the fact that we can generate our harvests, improve our soil health, improve our health outcomes, while also earning an income from adopting techniques and practices that actually increase the amount of greenhouse gases that our natural assets are absorbing. So that's one aspect. The data here is quite clear and quite granular that there are opportunities of this nature in almost every country in Africa. We also need to go from thinking about energy poverty, for example, which I talk about in the next slide, to how we unleash green industry. It is a reality that 600 million people on the continent currently do not have access to quality modern energy. And a lot of effort is going into asking the question, how do we address this gap and make sure that people in rural Africa, even in urban centers, have access to sustainable clean energy? It's an important piece of work, but we should not lose sight of the fact that as the world's renewable technologies advance in quality and efficiency, Africa happens to be sitting on some of the best renewable energy resources on Earth. So we're not an energy poor continent. We're an energy rich continent that just hasn't started tapping our potential. And you can see this in a number of ways. You can see this in just the sheer amount of potential energy available in each individual country. And notably, keeping in mind that because, as I said before, Africa doesn't have the big seasonal shifts that you see in many other parts of the world, this energy, particularly the solar energy, is available relatively consistently all year round. There will be some variations, but we need a lot less storage than you would in the temperate zones of the world. What does that mean in real terms? It means that if you set aside the cost of capital, if you set aside the fact that it costs more to borrow to invest in infrastructure in Kenya than in Germany, then to generate the same amount of reliable renewable power costs about 3 times as much in Germany as it does in Kenya, simply because you need way more solar panels and wind turbines and batteries in Germany than you do in Kenya to get to the same amount of production. Right? Now, nothing against doing renewable energy in Germany. What I am saying, though, is that if this picture is correct, then the cheapest energy in the world, which is a critical factor input for most industries, should be available right here on the continent. And that creates a whole range of opportunities for economic growth. So we then skip to the next slide. Now, you've got this picture of economic growth and so on. You need to translate it into policy. And that's a long journey. Some of that journey has begun with things like the Africa Climate Summit. This is a picture from the first one in 2023, which came out with the Nairobi Declaration here in Kenya. And in that declaration, the leaders of the continent did note that climate positive growth was one part of Africa's response to the climate challenge. And it was a big shift in African countries beginning to talk about whether there might be opportunities for us to grow by helping address this crisis. Right? And there was a second Africa Climate Summit just recently in Addis, where, importantly, in addition to leaders reaffirming their recognition of this opportunity, you are beginning to see more and more companies, investors, organizations actually showing that they can generate economic benefit from climate action. and more people taking an interest in what might come next in terms of investment and in terms of growth. So that's at the leadership level. What's our population saying? What's our young people saying? On the next slide. I think when you look at young Africans, one of the things we tried to do was actually engage with Africa's youth. So the leadership is starting to buy into the fact that there might be jobs to be had and economic growth to be had from climate action. But interestingly, what you hear when you talk to the next generation, to our Gen Z, is a real hunger for opportunity and employment. That's not new. A recognition of the fact that climate change is real, also not surprising, and a real hunger to not be thought of as just helpless victims. They want to have agency. They want to have their own fate in their hands, and they're looking for ways of applying their skills and talents and energy towards actually solving the problems that they can see around them. So you do have a willing population that's ready to embrace the skills that will come from installing renewable energy, or embracing regenerative agriculture, or embracing new forms of transport, or embracing new forms of construction. That hunger is there. The question is the investment following? And what will it take for the investment to follow? Next slide. So part of what's needed now is proof of concept. And that now ties us brings us from the theory of the case, which is what I've just talked about, the logic and the underlying ideas and some of the data that supports this idea that there's an opportunity in climate positive growth. I want to talk a little bit about what real businesses could look like that tap into Africa's potential for climate positive growth, because that's the work I do right now. A few years ago, we started Africa Climate Ventures on the very simple premise that if it is true that Africa has these hidden advantages that will become more pronounced as the world increasingly embraces climate action as an imperative, then there might be opportunities for one to invest in and grow a new category of businesses that perhaps could be globally competitive. Now, it's important to say that, and I recognize in some of the questions I often get asked, that this shift is happening regardless of the day-to-day shifts in the political tides. The best way I can illustrate this is, as we're listening to this part, as we're having this conversation right now, we are at the end of a year in which a lot of the public agenda setting, particularly in the West, around climate change has shifted. People are saying, well, maybe we do want to stick with fossil fuels. Maybe we do want to pull back from decarbonization as an agenda. And yet, even in this year, the data has been clear, and the publications that are coming out in the run-up to COP, the news coverage now of the data from the past year is completely unambiguous. Mind-blowing statistics, such as the fact that in the last 4 years, more money has been invested in the form of FDI into green technologies around the world than was invested during the entirety of the Marshall Plan. The fact that multiple countries now are rapidly shifting towards renewables as their primary source of energy. The fact that after many years of uncertainty around the future of carbon markets, agreements signed last year in Baku are translating at the previous COP, are beginning to translate into new structural, predictable demand for high-quality carbon credits, which is the way in which those who emit will eventually compensate those who have to clean up the mess in a way by either reducing their own emissions or removing emissions from the atmosphere. So there's a lot of data out there, which I won't go into too much now, that suggests that the tide, the core industrial tide, is a function of big structural shifts in the structure of the economy and technology that is partially driven by politics, but is partially driven by the rates of innovation that will shape the world of the future. And anyone who doubts this can spend a few days in China, the world's largest industrial nation, which is decarbonizing faster than anyone would have imagined possible and setting an example for others. Next slide. So what form does climate positive growing, how do you invest in climate positive growth in Africa, and how does it become real? I think the important thing is this is not something that sits in the abstract. It can be as tangible as saying, well, let's leapfrog African households from unsustainable cooking fuels, so firewood and charcoal, to a range of options. This can be LPG, it can be electricity, it can be ethanol, like the example in front of you, which we have invested in, which is a company, Cocoa Networks, that's delivering high-quality bioethanol-powered cook stoves to consumers in Rwanda and delivering a superior, cleaner experience than what they experienced before, subsidized through the sale of carbon credits to buyers around the world, hopefully soon to tap into what we now call compliance markets, which have much higher prices for high-quality carbon. So this is an example of taking a big global market for carbon, translating it into a high-quality, locally appropriate product that delivers benefits to the consumer in the form of health, convenience, and cost effectiveness, and which then hopefully scales while exporting applying benefit. That's one way to do this. But we can be a lot more direct. We can tackle the question of green industrialization very directly. And on the next slide, we show a way that we might do that. So this next example is a company, Great Carbon Valley, that I'm particularly fond of, that is trying to think through what does it take to attract new cutting-edge industries to Africa. Now, what you see on the screen looks like, you're drilling for something. Could be oil, could be something else. This is a drilling rig in the Rift Valley of Kenya. It is drilling underway by a company, Sela, that is looking at ways to mineralize carbon dioxide in the ground. This is a technique that has been proven in other places, including Iceland in Europe, as a way of getting rid of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and permanently locking it away. And it turns out that East Africa's geothermal zone, all of those amazing geothermal resources in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, and beyond, are uniquely well suited to this as an industrial activity. So the vision of Great Carbon Valley is saying, identify companies and technologies like carbon removal that can only be done in or can be particularly cheaply done in Africa, and attract them here by building new industrial bases and investing in the enabling infrastructure that will allow them to scale. The advantage of chasing new green industry is unlike many other industries where Africa starts off with a lag to other spaces, right? If you're getting into certain kinds of advanced manufacturing, you have a lot of catching up to do to the global leaders. Many of the industries that are emerging in as part of the climate response are literally a decade or two old. We have just as much homegrown expertise in many cases as many other parts of the world, and we have a larger number of young people, so more new young minds to apply to getting to the cutting edge. And so with Great Carbon Valley, we are laying the groundwork for attracting both novel new industries, but using that as anchor energy demand that would power existing industries as well. Now, that's industry. What about the land? On the next slide, we talk about Safi Organics. And this is an example. When I talked about regenerative agriculture earlier, one of the biggest drivers of carbon emissions today is emissions from agriculture. Part of the reason that agriculture emits a lot is that the current way that the current approach to modern agriculture, the way that we have approached agriculture since the Green Revolution, has relied very heavily on fossil fuel-based fertilizer, most of it imported to Africa to drive yields and improve output. Now, this has a couple of challenges, one of which is, in many cases, those fertilizers are very poorly suited to Africa's soils. If I refer to Kenya, for example, which is where I'm from, if you look at the map of the most acidic soils in the country and layer it on top of the map of the most productive agricultural land in the country, it's the same map because we are increasing our soil acidity from applying fertilizer to drive yield. And that means every year we're having to spend more and more and more to get the same result. Now, this company, Safi, a homegrown African company, making fertilizer using organic ingredients, selling that fertilizer, which is a fully blended fertilizer that has been shown to perform as well, and in some cases even better than imported chemical fertilizer for particular crops, selling that fertilizer at a price competitive with subsidized imported fertilizer, and doing so with a product that not only doesn't emit carbon dioxide from its manufacture, but actually represents removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In other words, you're taking material, waste biomass that would have otherwise gone back into the atmosphere as methane and carbon dioxide, and feeding it back into the ground as fertilizer. And it creates a future in which you could imagine many parts of rural Africa recycling the nutrients from last year's harvest to generate next year's yields. And doing so with state-of-the-art, highly specialized equipment that really targets maximizing both the climate benefit and the agronomic benefit. The last benefit I'll talk about when you add biochar, which is what Safi Organics uses, into the soil, is that biochar is a natural sponge. It holds water. So if the rains fail in the next season, your soil still retains a fair bit of moisture that allows you to get some yield. And it also holds nutrients, which means that even if you're using traditional fertilizer alongside, you need less of it than you previously did because less of it is being washed away and ending up in our water supplies and so forth. Right? So a way of really benefiting both the farmer, the climate, and the pocket in one virtuous cycle that reduces the dependence of many African countries on imported fertilizer. Next slide. And staying on the subject of soil acidity, I'll talk about maybe this last example. In many parts of Africa, one of the techniques that has gained momentum globally for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is using an approach called enhanced rock weathering. I won't get into too much detail about it. Safe to say that you're taking crushed rock that has particular chemical properties, spreading it on soil where it reduces soil acidity, and in reducing the soil acidity, in that same process, actually removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Or contributes to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so you can earn an income stream, as this company Temvelo is looking to do, from the carbon, while providing farmers and land managers an easy and expensive way of addressing soil acidity. Now, these are a few of the examples of early stage businesses that are tapping into particular African soil conditions or land conditions or industrial opportunities or consumer needs. But there are many more. And if you look at the next slide, there's opportunities across animal protein, thinking about heat to power, thinking about, really scaling up the production of biochar across the continent, and thinking about the future of mobility. We are the continent that's expected to see the greatest increase in access to modern forms of transport. Embracing e-mobility at scale in Africa has a huge implication for the future of climate change. And particularly because for many African countries, indeed for most African countries, embracing e-mobility would get rid of our single biggest import bill item, which is imported fuel to power our current automotive fleet. If you can shift from that to using renewables, it's a huge gift to the economy and a huge gift to the climate and the beginnings of a highly sustainable and scalable industry. So that's a little bit of a picture of what tangible opportunities could look like. And what I would say is these are the opportunities that make sense for us to go after as venture investors. But there are opportunities across the spectrum for large industry, for commercial agriculture, for construction, for various forms of land stewardship. The underlying message is that understanding the long-term economics of climate action is an important part of developing a smart strategy for investing and generating returns in Africa. And I hope many of you will seize the opportunity across the continent, whether you're on the continent or off of it, to tap what I believe is going to be one of the big themes of the 21st century. Because if one could argue that the way that China, for example, and much of Southeast Asia developed very rapidly in the 20th and early 21st centuries was to provide the world its industrial workforce and become the new factories of the world. If one can argue that the way that India has done so is providing knowledge workers in tech and business process outsourcing as a major new form of export and providing the world's knowledge workforce, I would argue Africa's path will be providing the world's climate workforce, the workforce that is needed if we are to avoid climate disaster and actually save the world. I think the continent is ready to step up to the challenge, and I hope you agree.